All right, looks like we are officially live. So today for our coaching call, I wanted to talk about writing goals for language therapy. I get a lot of questions about this, and this is something that I do address in Language Therapy Advanced Foundations. However, this is something that when it comes to just advocacy and just managing your time, it's really important that regardless of whether you're doing this for language therapy or whether you're doing it for just some other type of therapy, whether it be fluency, articulation, it's good to have a good process for writing goals. And because I get so many questions about this, I wanted to just talk a little bit about some of the mistakes and myths out there about goal writing and just some best practices that can help you to streamline this process for yourself. So, I wanted to outline some common things that are being done out there and then talk a little bit about pros and cons of these things. And then we can talk about the process that I used that really helped me to save a lot of time when it came to just really having a good process for goals so that I wasn't spending hours and hours writing IEPs. So let's talk a little bit about some of the things that are being used and the differences between them. So the first thing that is kind of the obvious thing that people use is that, number one, of course, you can write them from scratch for every kid, which I think we all know that that can get very time consuming and it doesn't always make sense to totally start from scratch without any process for each kid that comes across your plate. So that's always not a good, I think that pretty much everybody knows that that's not the best thing that you should do. But the strategy that a lot of people use is that they use pre-made goal banks. Sometimes your organization might have one. I remember when I first started working in the schools, there was this drop-down box that you could use in the IEP system that would be a goal bank. And sometimes I would use them. Sometimes they would say things that were kind of weird or things that I didn't think were appropriate or very functional. But I could use that and kind of tweak them so that they would be a little bit more functional. Um, and then a lot of times there are products, you can go on Teachers Pay Teachers. There are different softwares that you can use that have goal banks and all of those things. And so I'm not gonna, I'm not here to critique any specific product, but I will just say in general with goal banks, the problem or the potential problem with that is that if you are too reliant on things like that, then sometimes it does get a little bit like you kind of can get caught in this, these pre-made goals and you're trying to make a round peg fit in a square hole kind of a thing. And it can get easy to kind of miss the point of what you're trying to do and not necessarily write a goal that's going to be super relevant and help your kid. Because if it was created by somebody else that doesn't know your child that you're working with, well, then, that can sometimes take the problem solving out on your end, and then it can create some bad habits over time. So I'm not going to totally dismiss the idea of using a goal bank. I know that a lot of time it can it can save some time. I think that a lot of people do want to use some of these things that can cut down on the amount of decisions that you have to make. And writing a goal from scratch does sound kind of overwhelming. So using a goal bank where you can just kind of click and drag things does sound kind of enticing. But if you're too reliant on that and you don't know how to problem solve and think about specific skills that your students need and how to align that with what is going on in the classroom and what that child is going to need to succeed, then it can be kind of a crutch or a band-aid. So yes, it's okay to use goal banks if they are available, but you want to make sure that you're using them the right way and you're not getting too dependent on them. And then also something to just consider when we're considering about, making sure that we're not, being ableist and things like that. It's certainly not ableist to push a child beyond their comfort zone in the interest of teaching them a skill that's going to make them more independent. Sometimes we do need to ask kids to do things that are non-preferred tasks in order for them to grow. So doing that and considering the environment and the environmental expectations, that alone isn't ableist. But if we're doing it because we're kind of relying on this pre-made set of goals, then sometimes, we can kind of cross that line where we're not really thinking about what is in the child's best interest. So we want to be careful there where we want to think about, okay, am I writing this goal because it's just on a lot of these checklists that, are the things that a child is supposed to be doing, or am I doing it because this is a skill that the child doesn't have that they're going to need to succeed? And again, just considering the environmental expectations alone when you're writing goals is not ableist. But if you're getting too focused on what is, quote, appropriate rather than what is going to be a functional way that this child is going to be more successful in this situation and what's going to help them problem solve and advocate and, be able to modify their behaviors in a way that serves them, well, again, if we're not thinking about those things and going through that thought process, sometimes, again, being too reliant on pre-made checklists can be problematic to that extent. Again, I'm not being absolutist here saying never use a goal bank. I'm not saying that we don't want to consider the environmental expectations. We absolutely do. But we just want to make sure that we're thinking about all of these things and meeting a child where they're at. So again, usually goal banks usually there's this massive list. A lot of the ones that I've seen where it's like, here are the following directions goals, and then here's all the variations that you have here, and here are the grammar and syntax goals, and they're, over here. And then vocabulary goals and fluency goals and articulation goals. Like there's all these pre-made things that you can choose from. Usually that's how they're organized. Again, you just want to be smart when you use things like that. And you certainly do not need a goal bank. When I was in the schools, did not use a big goal bank. I had a goal bank of maybe 5 or 6 goals, and I would use them as kind of a starting point, and then I would just customize them in order to make them appropriate for what the child needed to do in their classroom in order to be successful. So I did not use a big goal bank because sometimes having too many choices to start from can actually be a little bit overwhelming. Because if you want to take a goal and modify it to make it appropriate for your student, if you have to sift through millions and millions of goals before you even get to that point that you're modifying it, that actually can make it harder and more overwhelming. Having more choices isn't always a good thing. Sometimes narrowing that and having kind of one goal that you start with for syntax and one for vocabulary, etc., having fewer things to start with can sometimes actually make it less overwhelming. So that's why I wanted to move to the second thing that I have on the list, which is a template. So we have goal banks. That's one method that can be used to write goals. And then we have templates. A template is a sentence frame outlining the syntax of a goal. And I'm going to show an example of that in a few minutes. Now, while I am a little bit hesitant to use huge goal banks and be super reliant on them, I do really like sentence frames. Again, syntax is my jam as far as what I teach kids, and I think it can be really helpful for you when you're writing goals as well. So we do want to have a particular sentence structure that we use when writing goals. What that does is it just helps organize your language so that you know how to write the goal. If you don't know how to word it, then that can make it hard to input the right language into that goal. So having a sentence template where you just kind of insert the necessary things into that goal is going to be super helpful. So that is something that I highly recommend that you use when you're writing goals. And I'm going to give you an example of that in just a minute here. So we've got goal banks, we've got templates. So those are 2 strategies that you can use when writing goals. And then you can have a goal writing process. So this is the way that you use the above tools that I just mentioned to generate a goal that's individualized, relevant, and measurable, or again, specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, and timely, a SMART goal. So this is the process that you use in order to write the goal using whatever tools it is that you choose to use, whether it be goal banks, whether it be just a couple goals that you choose from, or whether it be that you use the sentence frame when writing the goal. So what is less important is the tools, but what's really important is that you have a good process for using those tools. That's what's going to ensure that you're using or that you're writing goals that are functional and relevant to your students. So let me give you some specific examples of some things that could be helpful when you're creating this goal writing process. And I'm going to outline the steps that I use when I am writing goals. Okay, so what I usually start with is that while I shy away from big, massive goal banks, because again, when I used them, I would usually maybe only use 3 or 4 of the goals on the goal bank of 50 to 100 or whatever goals. So instead of making myself scroll through all of those goals, what I did is I just wrote my own goals and just created a couple really simple ones that I knew were going to help me cover my bases. And I did customize them for my students, but I did not I did not necessarily have this huge list that I was choosing from. So some of the basic goal examples that I would use would just be a basic sentence that states an observable behavior. And these are going to sound super general and broad, but remember, these are just the starting point, because what I do is I start what the goal bank has for me is that I start with a really general statement of a behavior that you can actually observe. And then when I write the goal using the sentence template, what I do is then I make the language a little bit more specific, depending on if it's the overall goal or whether it's the specific benchmarks. So some examples of things that might be in my goal bank if I'm writing language therapy goals is I might say something like will write correct sentences or will say correct sentences with correct syntax. Again, I know that's super general, but again, remember this is just the starting point, because writing and saying sentences are things that you can observe. So that is an example of a behavior that would be on my goal bank. I might also use a goal that might say something like, we'll name 3 to 4 attributes when describing an object. That's usually one of my go-to vocabulary goals that's focused on semantics, because I do recommend that you're addressing semantics in therapy if you have a child who has issues with language processing that impacts their comprehension and their writing quality and, just kind of that global impact academically. I recommend that as well. And usually one of the goals that I would start with would be naming and describing attributes. Again, you can observe someone naming or describing attributes about an object. And so that is something that you could put in your goal. Another example of an observable behavior that you might have in a goal bank could be answer questions about a paragraph. So these are just some sample language goals that I might have. And again, they're super basic, they're general. I can tweak the language when I'm actually writing the goal to make it more specific if I want to, depending on what's going on with that child. And, again, I could keep going with examples here. If I'm writing a goal for articulation, it might be something like, we'll say, this sound in isolation. We'll say this sound in prevocalic contexts. I might say something like, we'll say the sound in, all contexts of words at the sentence level. Or again, you might want to break that up a little bit more. But again, we're using an observable behavior and we're just changing it to make it appropriate for that particular student. So those are just some examples of things that you would use. And again, the goal bank should be just the basic observable behavior that you're going to start with. and you want to just have just a handful of them. With language goals, I usually will start with 5 or 6 of them. I might have one for syntax, one for correct grammar. I might have one for kind of a high level processing, answering questions. And then I'll have one for vocabulary that will be about, naming or describing an object. So we could make these more specific if we wanted to, when we're actually considering where the student is. So yeah, let me move on to the template, and then I'll show you some examples of ways that I could take those general behaviors and make them a little bit more specific. So once we have those observable behaviors, we've got kind of a list of them. Then we also want to pair that with the goal template, which is just the sentence structure of the goal. And a good place to start with for that will be student will insert observable behavior with insert amount of accuracy. So for example, we might say something like student will describe words using 3 to 4 attributes on 3 out of 4 trials, for example. So that is one way that we could insert the observable behavior from the previous slide that I had up. And then you also want to insert that amount of accuracy. So I talked about observable behaviors, and again, those are the things that are on the goal bank. But I wanted to talk a little bit about accuracy for just a second here. There's a couple different ways you can measure accuracy. You can do percentage, so you can say something like 80% accuracy. You can do number of trials, like I did in that example, 3 out of 4 trials. Or you could do the rubric. You could make a rubric for a specific task that you want them to do, and you might want to get, a certain score on the rubric. So maybe they get points for each thing that they do. And I do have a preference for writing goals a certain way, but there are pros and cons of doing this, all of these different ways. So with the percentage, that is ideal for something when you're going to have a lot of trials and you're going to have bulk. It's useful to do percentage when you just have, you're going to have a lot of trials across settings, and you have a way to accurately track that. So, for example, if you are going to say that, someone uses the R sound correctly with 80% accuracy across a number of different contexts, you've got a lot of different trials, that is useful, and that's probably going to give you better information than saying, 3 out of 4 times that they attempted to say an R, they did it correctly, because it's just more data. But sometimes it's hard to get enough data for a percentage to even be relevant. So for example, if a child did something with, 3 out of 4 trials, that actually might be a pretty good session for you. But if they're saying the R sound and they did it 3 out of 4 times, then, that sounds like 70%, that would be 75% accuracy. Well, that doesn't sound that good. But, ideally we'd want them to get them to be more accurate with that particular goal. So it can be kind of misleading in a way, when you're kind of going between, one activity that, has a longer amount of trials, like it takes you longer to get the number of trials. You might expect a lower accuracy for something that takes longer, but something that is kind of really quick, you might expect a higher amount of accuracy. So again, when you kind of start playing around with the data, sometimes it can be a little bit misleading. So it is important to kind of keep that in mind. So when you are doing something that's going to have, a lot of trials, it is better to do percentage if you have a means of actually tracking that, because then again, the data is more meaningful. But if you have something that takes longer, for example, describing words, that takes a little bit longer than just saying a word with an R sound. Well, in that case, it might be more relevant to do number of trials. If that's the situation, like let's say that you went through an activity with a child 4 times during a session and they did it correctly and independently 3 out of 4 trials, well, that's pretty good. If you were to do accuracy there, it would look like 75% accuracy. It might not look that great, but actually, really, that was a pretty good session. So always keep those things in mind. Just kind of think about how the data would actually look functionally. When I am writing goals, I tend to lean more towards accurate or towards number of trials. And if I have something where I think I can get more trials, I might do something more like 9 out of 10 trials. The reason I do that is because sometimes it's just really hard to actually get enough data for a percentage to not look misleading. So I tend to err more on the side of number of trials because I feel like that is a more honest way to represent the data that I got in the session. But, again, I'm not saying that you should never use percentage. In a perfect world, it would be better to do percentage, but we don't live in a perfect world. It's better to make sure that our data is not misleading. So keep those things in mind. It is, if you know that you're only going to be taking data in your session, I tend to err more towards number of trials, especially if it's something that takes a little bit longer. Now, rubrics are good if you have something that takes a long time. So for example, if you've gotten to the point where students are really working on carryover, then you might be working on things like writing, and you might have, maybe you're working on sentence structure, and you have students who are also working on things like punctuation and capitalization, and then the overall flow of their paragraphs, and did they get the right number of details, and you might have a bunch of different things that you're looking at. It can be really hard to get 80% accuracy with any one thing because they only do it once. That entire activity that you do might take a long time. So if that's the case, it's better to use something like number of trials or a rubric that's going to give you an overall score. And then you're looking more at just overall how many of the isolated skills did your student get rather than just that one, specific skill that you're targeting. So those are some different things that you might want to use. Again, when you're using rubrics, you do need to tweak the syntax of the goal a little bit. But yeah, those are just some things to consider with amount of accuracy. Now, something that I do not do in my goals is that a lot of times people will say something like given prompts or given access to, opportunities to self-advocate and, all of those things. I do not recommend writing goals like that because I think goals, like it's really hard to measure a goal when it's a paragraph long. I've seen some really wordy, confusing goals where I look at it and I think I'm confused. I don't know what's going on here. And it's so wordy and convoluted that I don't know what I want the student to do. And I think, how would a parent or even a teacher looking at that even understand what is supposed to happen there? So I tend to make my goals as concise as possible. I know why people say things like prompts, like given a verbal prompt or given, in whatever it is that you want the student to use to self-advocate. So I don't write those things because the goal is about what the student is doing. Those things are about what you're doing to scaffold and support the student. Now, when you're taking data, it's absolutely relevant to mention the scaffolding and supports that were needed in order for that student to do the task. Ideally, it's great if you can, if they're using prompts, it's always great to see if you can fade those prompts. However, when it comes to certain accommodations and self-advocacy, of course, if that's what the student needs, we don't necessarily want to take those things away. But we do want to document if they're necessary so that people know what those things are moving forward. The reason that I don't write them in the goal is because we should just be doing that. Like, I don't think you should have to write it in the goal. It should just be something that you're doing. Like, it should be a given that we're giving a student scaffolding and allowing them to self-advocate. That should be like, if you're writing an IEP, there should be an accommodation section that should show what that student has access to. And in your narrative, you should mention, in your data that you're collecting, you should mention the things that the student needs in order to be successful, whatever, however that looks. So I don't write that in the goal because I think it just makes the goal confusing. The only the only time that I would focus on the the self-advocacy things is if the goal is for the student to self-advocate. Then obviously you want to write it in the goal, like if you want the student to ask for help or use a specific strategy or when they need it, well then obviously you want to write it in the goal, and we want to be working on those things. So those things are important goals to have. But again, we should just be allowing those things. We shouldn't have to write them in the goals. I suppose you could make a case if you say, some people might say, if I don't write it in the goal, it's not going to happen. Okay, fine. I mean, if you really have a situation where you know that the student is not going to get what they need if they don't have it in the goal, then that could potentially be a case for writing it in there. But I think that should be self-evident. I know that a lot of people might disagree with me on that, but I do think that it's beneficial to at least start with making the goal, as clear as possible. So, some other things to consider, questions to ask yourself when you're writing these goals. And this is again why, I'm not totally against goal banks, but if we're just kind of clicking and dragging, it can be easy to get lost in the massive list of goals that we have here and sorting through all of those. So always we want to be asking, am I meeting my student where they're at? So while we do want to consider classroom expectations, because that's what the child is going to be exposed to, if a child is exposed to things in the classroom, then they're more likely to learn those skills. So it's reasonable to expect that they might, that those are reasonable things that you can be working on if you know that they've been exposed to this language and vocabulary. That is a good way to determine what kind of vocabulary we should be working on, is to consider what they've been exposed to in their environment, what other kids their age have been exposed to in their environment, and what other kids their age are doing. But that's more just from a starting point with helping them, helping to figure out what they need to be successful in that environment with their peers. It's not necessarily from a standpoint of, saying that they have to know and do everything exactly the same way that as their peers are doing it, but that is a good reference point to help them to kind of problem solve and figure out how they can be successful, especially, if they're interested in going to college and continuing to be on the academic track and being successful in the classroom, and also, developing peer relationships. Considering, what's expected in the environment is relevant so that they can have an understanding of that and understand how their behavior is going to be perceived, and what things that they will need to do in order to, do whatever the tasks are, whether it be following along with the classroom discussion, whether it be comprehending, whether it be keeping their assignments organized, or even social things, like, socializing with friends at recess and in the lunchroom and things like that. So the other thing that we want to consider is this an important skill my student will need to succeed versus what is considered appropriate? A lot of times when we get stuck in saying that's inappropriate, or, this is what you're supposed to be doing when you're this age, well, then that's where we can get into goals that can be perceived as ableist if we're just focusing on what's appropriate. What we want to focus more on is, what does the student need to succeed? Depending on the student's diagnosis, we might not necessarily get them to the point where they do everything and look exactly like their peers that are neurotypical, for example, but we do want to consider what's going on in that classroom and what the expectations are, because then we can figure out a way that works for that student to do it in a way that is going to help them be successful. So, again, for example, if they are like a basic one that I bring up a lot, where, if they need to sit or have a standing desk, for example, and they need to be able, or they need to have some kind of accommodation for their seating arrangements. Maybe they're sitting on a yoga ball, or maybe they're sitting at the front of the classroom where the teacher can check in with them. Um, again, whatever they need in order to be successful, it might look a little bit different. So the way that we write the goal and what our expectation is might be a little bit different for, compared to the other students. Another example would be we might expect the other students to just come into the classroom and, get all of their stuff together without any external, prompting from the teacher, or without any check-in, or without any kind of visual strategy. But for our student, our goal might not be for the student to just come into the classroom and do all of those things like the other kids. Maybe they might need some kind of scaffolding or support to do that. So again, the goal might not be for them to do all of those things or follow directions with, the X number of details. It might be to do the steps with supports. So it might be a little bit different. So that's where we want to kind of figure out, how is a student going to complete the task or perform in this environment in a way that's going to help them be successful, not necessarily, what is the way that everybody else is doing it. So does not mean that we give kids a pass and just let them, like we still need to probably, and we're still going to be asking them to do things that might be non-preferred tasks, but we are going to consider how we do that. We also want to consider the environmental expectations and do that more so than just developmental norms. I did discuss developmental norms last month, but we want to use developmental norms to indicate red flags, to indicate, which students might have, might not be following that typical developmental progression. And this might be, the goal might be to help them catch up. Or, if we know that they have a diagnosis, we know that they're not neurotypical. We might not expect them to follow that typical developmental progression. So the goal might not necessarily for them to meet those developmental norms, even though those developmental norms are useful in that screening and evaluation process. What we want to consider more is, what are the environmental expectations? What does the child need to do in order to be successful in light of those environmental expectations? And how do we help them do that? So it's kind of more of this problem solving process rather than just, again, like using the goal banks. And the reason why I kind of harp on the goal bank things is that sometimes, some of them that have been out there for a while do kind of consider just developmental norms and things like that rather than just environmental expectations. That's not always the case, but we want to just get away from just looking at these checklists and thinking, this is the way that it's going to have to play out for kids, at this age. Like, this is what I'm going to expect for a child at X age. And so that's what I'm going to write the goal for them. Again, one example that I've talked about a lot is kids who have lagging executive functioning skills. Well, we might not expect them to be able to complete certain tasks the exact same way that other kids do in their classrooms. We might expect them to, do things, but we might be providing some additional supports in order for them to meet those expectations or do whatever those tasks are. And sometimes the expectations that we have might be modified based on where the child is at developmentally, and also depending on what their diagnosis is. So we want to consider that. We don't necessarily always want the goal to be for them to be at grade level, because that might not be appropriate for them. So that is my process for writing goals. Again, we start with a basic goal bank of observable behaviors, that I listed up here with goal bank examples. Again, some basic things like we'll write correct sentences, we'll name 3 to 4 attributes when describing an object. So again, some general behaviors that we make more specific when we put them into the template That is our sentence structure for writing the goal. And we use that process for writing the goal itself. So we want to just make the goal specific to that particular example. Let me just give, while I'm talking about these goal bank examples, let me just give a couple more examples of how I might take a language goal and make the observable behavior a little bit more specific before I wrap up. So the ones that I mentioned today, so if I'm writing a goal for syntax, I might say something like, we'll say or write correct sentences. So that's pretty basic. It doesn't really give a lot of information. It might be okay if for a long-term goal, but if you want a short-term objective, you're probably going to want to make it more specific so that you actually know what you're working on. So for example, a goal that I might write, instead of just saying we'll say correct sentences, I might say something like we'll say sentences with correct conjunction use on 3 out of 4 trials. I might even modify that goal. Instead of having them say correct sentences, I might say something like, we'll combine sentences to form complex sentences on 3 to 4 trials, or 3 out of 4 trials. So I might have them actually combine 2 sentences into 1 sentence. So I might actually write that into the goal. I might say something like, I might even, if the goal is for complex sentences, I might do something like, we'll write correct complex sentences on 3 out of 4 trials, so I can kind of dive into specific sentence structures. I might even say something like, we'll say sentences with correct subject-verb agreement. So I can start inserting specific sentence types there and use that same basic concept of saying or writing correct sentences and just put specific examples of skills in there. If I wanted to use that goal for grammar, I could say something like, we'll say sentences with correct verb tenses and plural markers on 3 out of 4 trials. I might say something like, if you're working on preposition use, you could use that same sentence frame for that type of goal as well. So these are just some examples of where you can actually start inputting some of those specific goals. When I do the answer questions about a paragraph, I might do different variations of that goal. So I could make that goal a little easier, and I might say we'll answer questions about complex sentences on 3 out of 4 trials, because sometimes you want to see if kids can comprehend at the sentence level. So you might want to make that goal a little bit easier. You could also say something like, you can make the type of questions that they answer a little bit more specific. So maybe you want them to answer WH questions about a paragraph. Maybe you want to hone in on a specific type of WH question. Maybe you've been working on comprehension questions for ages and you know that there's 1 or 2 types of questions that just really trip them up. Maybe they can answer basic concrete questions like who or what, but they can't answer why questions. So maybe you just write a goal, will answer why questions about a paragraph. You can also have them, when you're talking about answering questions, break it up by question type. So maybe we'll answer inferential reasoning questions. You could do that goal. You could also we'll answer questions about details. You could do a goal for, we'll answer questions about the main idea. So as you start to work on these things, I do recommend in language therapy, you start kind of broad. And then as you start working on these skills, you're going to be able to pinpoint which skills are going to need specific goals written about them over time. So I recommend that you start broad and then you hone in over time once you realize which specific skills a student is struggling with. But when you get a brand new student and you have a brand new language IEP, it's a little easier to start broader, because what that does is that it allows you to work on a number of different skills and kind of, as you're doing therapy, continue to be diagnosing the problem, because you're not going to have all the answers after the eval. You're going to continue learning about that student as you're working with them. So you don't want to, you don't want to just pigeonhole yourself into working on specific goals. If there's a way that you can make them a bit broader and make it a little bit more flexible. Again, we want to still use observable behaviors because we want the goals to be specific enough that you can actually measure them. But then, as you take data on those goals, you can make your data a little more specific. So, let's say that you had a broad goal for naming 3 to 4 attributes about a word when describing an object. And you could start taking data on that goal, and then you could, notice that maybe the student is really good at describing functions. So, when you write your data, you can say something like, they were able to name, 3 functions of this object. And you might note that they never are able to identify the category, or they're never able to identify physical attributes. So you might note that, and the next time you write that goal, maybe you might say something like, we'll name 3 to 4 attributes, including the category. So you might make the attributes that you want the student to do more specific as you start working on that goal. I do recommend keeping it broad at the beginning, but then it's okay to hone in once you've been working on that goal for a while. So these are just some examples of just kind of my process for thinking through this. Excuse me. So with that, we will wrap up, and let me know if you have any questions.